Dawn of War 4's DLC plans may have just given us our biggest clues yet about where the story is heading after launch, and there are some very interesting possibilities hiding in the details. As part of the Commander Edition and Year 1 roadmap, we now know that Dawn of War 4 is getting 2 major story expansions. The first one is all about the Bloodraven's story prologue, while the second is called Aftermath. Now, once you start digging into what we know about these expansions, a very interesting picture starts to emerge. But let's start off with the Bloodraven's story prologue. So the official description tells us that before the main campaign begins, a strike force of Bloodravens returns to Aurelia, their ancestral homeworld. Under the guidance of a legendary commander, they undertake a mission that sets in motion events which ultimately shape the fate of Cronus. Now immediately, one phrase of course jumps out: legendary commander. The obvious question, well, who is it? The first possibility that many Dawn of War fans will immediately think of is of course Gabriel Angelos. Because after all, if you're talking about legendary Bloodravens commanders, well, Gabriel has to sit right at the top of the list. He's arguably the most iconic character in the entire franchise. However, there is a bit of a problem. In a previous interview with IGN, the developers specifically said that Gabriel Angelos would not be appearing at the beginning of Dawn of War 4 because he is simply too powerful. Now, that explanation made perfect sense at the time. If you do start the game with Gabriel Angelos already present, it becomes kinda difficult to explain why he isn't immediately, well, solving every problem himself. But things have kind of changed slightly since then, because now we know that Lion L. Johnson appears in the main campaign. Despite being one of the most powerful characters in the setting, if the developers are willing to bring a Primarch in later on in the campaign, well, perhaps the argument about Gabriel Angelos being overpowered becomes less of a limitation, but rather about timing. And this is possibly where there's a bit of a loophole. The developers specifically talked about Gabriel not appearing at the beginning of Dawn of War 4. Technically speaking, the Prologue DLC isn't quite the beginning of the game itself. It's additional content released separately. Now, whether that distinction matters remains to be seen, but it's certainly enough to keep the Gabriel Angelos theory alive. But the other candidate that immediately comes to mind is Jonah Orion, because he already has a strong connection to Aurelia through the events of Dawn of War 2 and Chaos Rising. He has also been confirmed as part of Dawn of War 4's story, and interestingly, he hasn't been announced as one of the last stand heroes, at least on launch. Now bear in mind, we do know that in the first DLC, the legendary commander, or at least another commander, will be added to the last stand game mode. So essentially, that could potentially leave room for him to become the new commander unlocked through the Prologue expansion. Of course, there could be an entirely different character that we haven't yet heard about, but right now, I feel like Gabriel Angelos and Jonah Orion feel like the strongest candidates. The second major mystery is who the Bloodravens are actually fighting on Aurelia. My leading theory right now has to be Chaos, and there are several reasons for this. First of all, the developers released a teaser crossword puzzle back in December 2025, and one of the answers was, well, simply chaos. That itself, of course, is not proving anything, but it certainly feels quite deliberate. More importantly, in an IGN interview discussing the game's faction choices, the developers talked about chaos and said there were story reasons why chaos would be better fit later on in the overall narrative, rather than coming on launch. Now that wording has always stood out to me. Not never, not we are not interested, just that chaos would fit better later. Well, what if that later is exactly what these DLCs are for? And then there's the Bloodravens themselves. Whenever Aurelia appears in Dawn of War lore, chaos is never really that far away. The entire Aurelia subsector was the setting for Chaos Rising, one of the most beloved Dawn of War expansions ever made. The Bloodravens' history is deeply intertwined with the Chaos corruption, mysterious origins, and dark secrets. And so returning to Aurelia without Chaos being involved in some way would kind of feel strange. Having said all that, there is another possibility. the enemy could in fact be Tyranids. The developers have spoken extensively about Tyranids in interviews, and in fact Jan Taysen explained that Tyranids were actually considered, but presented challenges because, well, every faction in Dawn of War 4 was intended to have its own campaign and narrative perspective. Tyranids of course are fantastic enemies, but they are possibly much harder to build an entire story campaign around because they don't really communicate in the traditional sense. What's interesting about the explanation is that it doesn't rule out Tyranids as enemies. It only explains why they weren't selected as one of the launch playable factions. Aurelia also has its own history with Tyranid invasions, so there is definitely some precedent for them appearing. Also, if Tyranids are merely enemies in the Prologue DLC, that would leave Chaos available to become something much bigger later. And that of course is where things get really interesting, because we've still got to talk about the second DLC on the roadmap. However, before we do, I just want to say a very big thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel, and if maybe this is like your second or third video and you plan to stop by again, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and you hit the notification bell so that you get a bit of a ding dong when the next update video comes along. But now, after all that, let's talk about Aftermath. According to the official description, Aftermath takes place after the main campaign and introduces an entirely new faction to Dawn of War 4. The expansion continues the story, explores the consequences of the campaign's ending, and allows players to command this new faction across all of the game modes. Now, the phrase entirely new faction could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. It could mean a faction that has never appeared in the game before, or it could simply mean a new playable faction. And that is kind of an important distinction, because if Chaos appears only as an enemy force and not playable in the Bloodraven's prologue, then technically, Chaos could still be an entirely new playable faction when Aftermath launches. And if Chaos is coming, there is actually a detail that some fans have already noticed. The artwork for Aftermath features a prominent yellow stripe. Some players have pointed out that the color scheme bears some similarities to the Iron Warriors. Now, before anyone starts declaring that Iron Warriors have been confirmed, let's be clear, this is of course complete speculation, but it's not without any basis at all, because I think Chaos has a really strong possibility of coming. And in fact, if Chaos were the faction being introduced, Iron Warriors would actually make a lot of sense from a gameplay perspective. Because one of the reasons that the developers previously gave for not choosing Death Guard was that they occupied similar design spaces to the Necrons. Both are slow, durable, attritional armies. Iron Warriors, though, don't have that same problem. In Warhammer 40k, Iron Warriors are heavily focused on siege warfare, artillery, ranged firepower, fortifications, and overwhelming battlefield fire support. In all likelihood, they would play very differently from Necrons, while still giving players a Chaos faction. And so if Chaos is the big Year 1 expansion faction, Iron Warriors are certainly one possibility worth considering. Having said all of this, there is another faction sitting quietly in the background, and that is the Imperial Guard, or Astra Militarum if we are being proper. Now, what's interesting is that Dawn of War 4 already has a huge amount of Guard content. We've seen them featured prominently, they are used in the tutorial campaign, and the developers have already created a substantial number of assets for them. In fact, that's why I originally expected one of the DLCs might indeed focus on making the Imperial Guard fully playable. It's still on the cards, I think, but the more information we get, I feel like that theory becomes harder to support. It is a bit weird though, because it probably would be the easiest thing for the developers to do. But after all, the Bloodravens prologue is obviously going to be centered on the Bloodravens. Aftermath specifically talks about an entirely new faction. The cool thing is that by the time Aftermath releases, players will have probably already spent considerable time fighting alongside and maybe even against Imperial Guard forces during the main game. And that of course makes them feel less like an entirely new faction and more like an existing part of the world that simply isn't that much playable yet. But could the Guard still become playable eventually? Well, absolutely. But based on the wording we are seeing right now, it feels like Chaos is a stronger candidate for the spotlight. Ultimately, the biggest question is whether these two DLCs are connected. Is the Bloodraven's prologue secretly setting up the villains of the Aftermath? And maybe we are going back to Aurelia only to uncover a Chaos threat that survives into the post-main campaign storyline. Or maybe it's going to be Tyranids emerging as the hidden danger on Aurelia, while Chaos arrives later to take advantage of whatever happens on Cronus. Right now, of course, we don't have definitive answers, but it's always nice to speculate. Now, between the references to Chaos in developers' interviews, the Bloodravens' history on Aurelia, the mysterious legendary commander, and the promise of an entirely new faction after the main campaign ends, it certainly feels like King Art Games is laying down the groundwork for something much bigger than a simple side story. It seems like whatever is coming our way is going to be a lot of chaos, regardless of if said faction appears. In any case, if chaos really is waiting in the wings, the war on Cronus may only be the beginning. But what I want to know is what you guys think about the theories. Who do you think is going to be the legendary commander in the Bloodraven's prologue? Who do you think will be the main enemy on Aurelia? And of course, which playable faction do you think will be coming with the second DLC to try and take things over at the end of the main campaign? Let me know in the comment section below. I think overall that it will be the chaos that comes to Dawn of War 4, and that Jonah Orion will be leading the Bloodravens in the Prologue DLC. Either way, I'm pretty interested to see what you guys think, but until my next video, take care and see you next time.